What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a bit of news, really, about Owlcat Games, the developer behind a couple of my favorite CRPGs, and what they've got going on for 2025 and beyond. So, over the past year, we've learned that Owlcat has become a publisher for 2 games. They are themselves working on 4 games internally. The Void Shadows DLC for Rogue Trader launched and was very well received, but naturally, as one of the bigger CRPG companies out there at this point, I'm very curious as to what they've been doing next, and I'm sure you are as well if you clicked on this video, but we got a few answers there in the form of a Reddit AMA that Owlcat posted their various answers to over on all of their social channels, really, and I'll link that directly down below if you want to take a look at the whole thing, as I'm not covering every single question that was asked, mostly just sticking to the most important stuff. Now, right out of the gate, I do want to start with, obviously, the most interesting things, like what are their actual releases planned for 2025. So we already know that they've been working on the second DLC for Rogue Trader. This is called Lex Imperialis and features a member of the Adeptus Arbites and the collection of the Imperial Tithe. Now, beyond that, we don't know exactly what their internal plans are, but here in this AMA, they did actually announce that they are planning several reveals for 2025. So likely, I would say summertime or perhaps a little later in the year, or at any other number of award or announcement type shows, will very likely get some answers to specifically what they have been working on, because as they answered questions throughout this AMA, that definitely seems to be up for debate, because they confirmed over the course of this thing that they're not making another Pathfinder or Starfinder title currently, though they are not opposed to doing so in the future, but there is not one currently in development. One of their 4 projects is in fact an isometric CRPG though, but they've also explained that they're not really working on any original IP, but it is something that they want to do in the future, at least when it comes to CRPGs specifically, which is probably worth a mention because I feel like they said one of their titles was a original IP previously, but I'm having a hard time sourcing that down. But like the third question in this AMA answers was, will they be making a CRPG in their own original IP, which obviously doesn't preclude other genres. But putting that stuff together, we know that they're making an isometric CRPG, again, seemingly a licensed one, but not Pathfinder, Starfinder. They also answered a question about a Shadowrun CRPG, where they said they're not against it, but it's not being worked on currently, which was the same with World of Darkness as an example, or even Warhammer Fantasy. And while they are certainly interested in making titles for that stuff eventually, right now that's not the case, which begs the question what this isometric CRPG they're working on actually is then, because by these answers it would of course be licensed, but the seemingly obvious suspects are apparently not in the running. So it'll certainly be curious to see, once they actually start revealing all this information, what it winds up actually being. Now, a little bit more on their more future plans. Obviously, they are still planning on making isometric CRPGs, especially licensed ones, but they also gave answers to a few other questions which I thought were interesting over the course of a few different answers. We got a little bit of information about the upcoming Lex Imperialis DLC, namely that it will be bringing in new portraits to the game, as well as adding some additional star systems, presumably with explorable planets and locations, which would make sense because Void Shadows took place primarily on your own Void ship, so the locations were, on your ship. Whereas it would seem with this new DLC, we'll be actually getting some new places to explore. That is to say, out in the galaxy, as it were, as opposed to right here at home. Now, they also answered a few other questions about Rogue Trader just generally that I thought were really interesting. Right away, are there any more DLC planned after Lex Imperialis? Now, they actually just recently put out a DLC survey for Rogue Trader generally, so very clearly they are looking into the idea, and perhaps unsurprisingly then, they answered this question by basically saying that if it is financially feasible and there is interest there in those DLCs, then yes, they would like to make more afterwards. Outside of Lex Imperialis, they even mentioned that one of the more common requests that they've seen overall would be like bigger ships and things like that, so that could potentially be a place to look at in DLC. That is to say, having different ships you could swap out in between. So there is potential for Rogue Trader to have a very long post-launch support arc, much like Wrath of the Righteous did. Now, they also answered some other questions about Rogue Trader, though. For starters, how it performed, overall. Did it meet expectations, basically? And they said yes. It recently was announced that it sold over 1 million copies, actually. And what's more, Void Shadows, the first DLC, was extremely well received, which included for me, actually. I really loved that DLC. It was very very good, so I think if they do more of that, they'll be in good shape. So basically, Rogue Trader seems to have done well on basically every front, except, of course, all of the various bugs on launch, which they did address, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Because they also talked a little bit about Rogue Trader's companions. Specifically, people asked if they had any plans to update Ulfar, our Space Marine companion, as he is a little underwhelming mechanically compared to all of the other companions, largely due to his, gear and overall viability, just in terms of everything he's got going on. So they're looking at potential ways to fix that in any future updates they do. They're not obviously going to set anything in stone at the moment, but it's on their radar. But then somebody asked a really interesting question, which was if there were any companions that were planned for Rogue Trader but were ultimately scrapped. And the answer was surprisingly yes, 3 of them actually. At one point they had considered adding in a Slanesh Demonette as well as a Heretic Witch that were ultimately cut because they didn't quite fit into the story very well. And then apparently they were at one point also planning on adding a Nocturne of Oblivion as an actual companion, which is a character that plays an important role in the story. But as things unfolded and development got underway, they said it became clear that he was probably better off being a more mysterious figure that aids the plot, rather than being a full-fledged companion that you actively interact with, and thus taking away some of the mystique that is inherent with his character, which honestly I kind of agree with. While I think he probably would have really been a cool character to, have as a companion, I've got to say I don't think it would have aided the story quite as much as just being a more mysterious figure. Now, the rest of the questions I want to go over from here were basically about the studio's future and, how they see things going forward and just some general information there that I thought was of note. For starters, somebody asked going forward what their biggest areas for improvement were internally, like what do they see as things to focus on. Now, we know from previous conversations and stuff that voiceover and graphical fidelity are a big part of those, as those are, unsurprisingly, the 2 biggest complaints they get, but they also mentioned a few other things here and there. For starters, pacing and reactivity. So, like many games, truth be told, Owlcat's games tend to have a really strong start, but, kind of fade off towards the end. Basically, the last couple acts are much weaker than, the rest of the game. Now, some of that comes down to just straight up regular old game development where, things get rushed because you start running out of time, that kind of thing. But it is something they're working on, specifically to make their games a little bit shorter, but also more reactive at the same time. Basically, using that shortened length to allow more player options and choice and consequence as a result. So that's something they're working on. And then, of course, probably the biggest one, I'm sure, is handling the bugs on release of their actual games. Rogue Trader had a very messy start if you tried to do anything besides a dogmatic run. The dogmatic pathway through the game worked pretty well, actually, comparatively to everybody else. But Heretic and Iconoclast especially were not in good shape. And as such, there were a bunch of bugs on release. Now, they were able to much more quickly get those fixed compared to previous games of theirs like Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous. Kingmaker they lost the rights to, we'll circle back to that. But as they've been scaling up and using the success they've had, obviously a big focus for them is on trying to catch a lot of that stuff internally before it makes it out to release, and they said some of those processes are already in place, which is why the launch of Void Shadows went pretty smoothly actually. So we're starting to see the consequences of some of that. But obviously that's the kind of thing that, saying it is one thing and doing it is another. So I would say until they release a game that is pretty bug-free, or at least, as bug-free as any game's going to get, which will never literally be 0, mind you, then obviously they've got some trust to build back up there. But obviously they're aware of the issue and they're taking it seriously, which at the moment is pretty much all you can ask for. But then on to the slightly more fun stuff. Somebody asked if they ever considered making sequels to any of their games as opposed to standalone experiences. And while I suppose I kind of knew this, I guess it was a little surprising to see how bluntly they basically said no. And that is largely because the way their games work, the choices and consequences contained therein are vast and numerous, and trying to condense any of those down and force them into a certain conclusion so they could make a sequel based on set choices isn't something they really want to do, because they feel like it'll take away from the experience of the player who, made a bunch of choices, got their ending, and then suddenly that's not actually what happened because they made a sequel and canonicized things. which I thought was kind of neat. Now, they also answered a question about, expanding into other genres and stuff, and basically said that they wanted to retain focus on isometric CRPGs, of course, but also experiment and branch out into other genres, which is something that is already underway. For instance, they're making a game in Unreal Engine 5, which is going to be much higher production value than the stuff they are working on otherwise or previously, and I don't get the impression that that one is a full-blown isometric CRPG, but seeing how they're also making an isometric CRPG, I don't think it'll be too big of a deal. Someone also asked about mod support going forward, and while there are mods already available for their games, and they are totally fine with that being the case, they do think they have some room to grow here in terms of, getting proper mod support to where they would like it, but it does look like that's something that they would like to support properly in the future. And then some rapid-fire questions here towards the end. Somebody asked what the worst aspects of their games they had made previously was, like what was received the most poorly, basically, and they said the Crusade mode for Wrath of the Righteous, and while they tried to update it and fix it, if they were to go back and do it again, they would probably just scrap it entirely and try something differently, which was a bit of blunt honesty I can appreciate. Someone also asked if they had a thing for evil companions and why there was so many, and they responded that, if you go by, representation of various alignments, it's pretty even. It would just seem that for whatever reason, their evil companions always seem to more readily find an audience among their player base than the other ones, which is probably true given that you've got Camilla, Dayran, Regil, Marazai, just off the top of my head as an example, which I thought was kind of a funny answer. It was asked if they actually didn't like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and they said that was false. While they can't unilaterally speak for everyone that works at the studio, they don't have anything against it, and that both 1st Edition and 2nd Edition Pathfinder each have their own respective charm, and at least one of their team members is pretty into it, so we'll see what happens there. Somebody asked about their favorite bugs, and I thought this was funny because they mentioned things I had encountered. For people who have played their games a long time, you may have been familiar with a bug that would cause a crossbow that was very large to just randomly show up in places like the main menu, which was a pretty big issue. And then perhaps more famously, because it got very memed, was the jaw or musculature issue that Cassia and Irilette had in Rogue Trader. Basically, if you don't know, anytime you would equip those two characters with a two-handed weapon, like the staves or rifles that they come sort of with by default, it would mess up their character model in the character screen. It would give them this severe underbite and kind of distort their features, and it looked insane. And they had a lot of trouble trying to fix it. But it was, if nothing else, very funny. And then, last but not least, somebody asked about the rights to Kingmaker. So I thought this was interesting because if you're unaware, despite Kingmaker being Owlcat Games' first game, they don't actually have the rights to it anymore. They lost the rights to that game when they went independent, and basically somebody asked if they would ever try to get them back. And while they have been trying to get them back, it's not looking likely, especially anytime soon. So while it's not something they'll likely ever completely give up on, it's not looking good anytime soon. But that pretty much wraps up the most interesting stuff from this AMA that they published answers to, and again, thought some of it was interesting and gave us a look at what they are up to in the future. And as I would say one of the main players in the CRPG space, I naturally want to stay up to date with what they are doing and, of course, bring all that news to you. So hopefully you found some of that interesting. And if you'd like to read some of the other questions that were asked and their answers, of course, again, link to all that down in the description below. And while you're at it, perhaps like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.